All right, let's dive into a really fascinating, and I gotta say, provocative argument from the author Christina Hoff Sommers. She makes this case that when you look at social movements, there are two very different emotions at play. One she calls righteous indignation, and the other, deep-seated resentment. So let's unpack how she builds this argument.
Okay, so this right here, this is the core of her entire critique. On one side, you have what she calls righteous indignation. Think of it as a controlled, focused fire for justice, like Plato's good steed that helps you do the right thing. But on the other hand, you've got resentment. She describes this as a simmering, nurtured passion, something that you can even feel on behalf of other people. And this distinction, well, it's absolutely key to everything that follows.
So here's how we're gonna break this all down. First, we'll get really clear on indignation versus resentment. Then, we'll look at what the author calls the politics of victimhood, see some of her real-world examples, explore what it means to live on the verge, and finally, get into her claim about a war on gender. All right, first things first. Let's dig into what the author actually means by these two very different emotional engines that she says fuel activism. So, in her view, righteous indignation is a good thing. It's that moral passion that gives you the horsepower to go out and fix a real injustice. The key here is that it's focused, it's about righting a specific wrong, and it's controlled. It's basically a tool for doing the right thing.
And then you have resentment, which is, well, a whole different beast. She describes it as something that you hold on to, you feed it. And here's the really critical part. She says it can be vicarious. You can feel it burning inside you for something that happened to someone else. And what does that do? She claims it just magnifies the villainy, blowing up a single issue into a much, much bigger fight.
So how exactly does this resentment get scaled up into what she calls the politics of victimhood? Let's look at the step-by-step process she lays out for turning a personal grievance into a full-blown political framework.
Okay, so how does this actually work? Well, according to the author, it's a three-step process. First, you identify with a victim. That creates an us. Next, you stop seeing the person who did the wrong thing as just an individual. Instead, they become a representative of a whole group, them. And boom, the final step, you've created this political reality that's just a constant battle of us versus them.
Now, to back this up, Sommers points to this quote from the feminist scholar Sandra Bartke. She presents this as evidence that a key step in developing this particular kind of feminist awareness is to start seeing yourself and your own experiences through the lens of being a victim. It's that mental shift, she argues, that really powers the politics of resentment.
All right, enough with the theory. Let's get into the concrete, real-world examples the author uses to argue that what she calls resentment feminism has jumped from the page into real life. She first points to this quote from Marilyn French. So French lists all these terrible acts, everything from paying women less all the way to murder, and then she concludes that the vast majority of men are guilty of at least one. Sommers uses this to say, see, this is a perfect example of blaming an entire group for the actions of individuals.
And then there's this one from Diana Scully. The author brings us up to show how she thinks the whole script gets flipped. Suddenly, the assumption is potential guilt. The question isn't, why do some men do this terrible thing, but rather, why don't the rest of you do it? Which implies it's some kind of natural urge that good men have to fight against.
And this last example, wow, it's about some male students at Vassar who were falsely accused of rape. Even after they were cleared, an assistant dean is quoted as saying their pain was kind of a good learning experience. Sommers uses this to argue that a new idea has emerged. You're guilty even if you're proven innocent, just by belonging to the wrong group.
Okay, so what does all this actually feel like for people living inside this worldview? Next up, we're going to explore the personal and professional impact, a state the author calls life on the verge. The author talks about these conversations she's had with college students about being on the verge. They describe it as this moment of transformation, where your eyes are opened and suddenly you see oppression everywhere, in everything. As one student apparently put it, it's a place where nothing is funny anymore. Just a constant, intense awareness. And to show how this plays out professionally, she tells this incredibly detailed story from the Boston Globe back in 1991. A group of very well-known female journalists actually formed a group and called themselves Women on the Verge. Their goal? To push back against what they saw as a macho newsroom culture. So all this tension basically exploded over one specific comment. A senior editor, David Nyhan, was heard teasing another guy for not wanting to play basketball, calling him pussy-whipped. A member of the Vergies, as they were called, overheard it, and the whole thing just blew up.
And the response was not small. The newsroom had just had these sensitivity trainings, and Nyan was hit with a $1,250 fine. The author holds up this number as proof of just how serious this remark was taken and how much power this new way of thinking had inside the organization.
But here's where it gets complicated. The author includes this quote from Ellen Goodman, who was actually one of the founding members of the Women on the Verge group, and even she seemed to feel like things went too far, creating this unhealthy vibe where everyone felt like their every single word was being policed.
Okay, let's pull back and look at the big picture. We're going to get into the author's argument about the wider impact on society, which she frames with a pretty loaded question. Are we actually in a gender war?
Well, she argues this mindset is trickling all the way down to elementary schools. She gives these examples where, from her perspective, normal kid stuff is being seen through this intense political lens. You know, a playground game of flipping skirts gets called gendered terrorism. A boy pushing a girl is framed as a sexual offense. And it's led to these really strict harassment policies for kids as young as 5.
The Lorena Bobbitt case is another perfect example of these two completely different ways of seeing things, at least as Sommers presents it. She describes supporters making V for victory signs with their fingers like scissors, seeing her act as a kind of justified revenge. But the author's critique is that a really complex, messy, personal tragedy got turned into a simple political symbol for feminist rage.
So, what's her bottom line? It's this. She argues that the whole idea of a secret, society-wide war against women is a myth. She says men in the real world aren't sitting around making battle plans. Her ultimate claim is that if there is a gender war happening, it's actually being waged by the very feminists who are operating from this place of resentment. And all of this really leaves us with one big, lingering question that her critique forces us to think about. How can any movement for justice fight for what's right without falling into what she calls the trap of resentment? It's a tough question, and it's right at the heart of this entire debate. Thanks for tuning in to This Explainer.